everyone has gone. Cool. Okay, we'll kick off. So hey everyone, and welcome to today's Public Policy Design Speaker Series. We have a fantastic speaker with us today. We've got Jeremy Myerson joining us. So Jeremy co-founded the Helen Hamlyn Centre for Design, and today he'll be exploring the potential of human-centred and participatory processes to affect change. So in terms of housekeeping, we will be recording the session. So toward the end, if you'd like to ask a question, which we really encourage to have that engagement with Jeremy, you'll have to come on the camera and accept the pop-up that comes on your screen. In terms of the format, we'll be running a 30 to 35-minute presentation with some time at the end for a Q&A. So please feel free to pop any questions in your chat and we can come back to them at the end. And I think that's about it. So I will hand over to Andy to give you a bit of an overview of the community itself.
Hi everyone, just a quick welcome from me and to make sure you know where you are. This is a public policy design community event of civil service. We are the UK's government's expert community of practice for designers who particularly specialise in working upstream with policy makers and ministers. We have about 1,000 members in 165 UK government organisations, and we would love you to join us if you are a UK government official. Every month we have a mix of meet-up events and working groups and newsletters to keep you informed about design and help you build your practice. But we also work externally with people outside of UK government as well. So if you fall into that camp, you can connect with us during these via our blog. So we publish blog posts every fortnight, and you can connect with us on LinkedIn as well. We, of course, run these monthly speaker series events as well, which are so brilliantly put together by Zara. Thank you very much. And you can go and have a look. We archive all of our old events on our website. And you can go back and re-watch all of the past speakers that you may not have seen. Those include people like Marianne Cassidy from the Irish Civil Service talking about their kind of life events programme that they're using to reform Irish government, and people like architect Inji Johar talking about systems and thinking and futures. But one of the topics that our community is particularly passionate about is inclusive design. So I'm really pleased that Jeremy is joining us today. So I hope you enjoy this session. I'll put some information in the chat. Do connect with us and hope to work with you in the future some more. Zara.
Great. I will hand over to Jeremy now.
Okay, everybody. I hope everyone can hear me. It is fantastic to be speaking to such a large group with an amazing objective to work in a design-led way to make public policy. And what I want to do is I want to share with you some of my experiences as co-founder and the former director of the Helen Hamlyn Centre for Design at the Royal College of Art. So I'm just going to share some slides because this is a very visual presentation. Shout if you can't see my slides. I hope you can. And the title of my talk is For the People, With the People, By the People, and it refers to levels of participation in the design process. And one of the reasons why I'm so pleased to be speaking at this event is that I want to share some of the learnings from a journey that started in the early 1990s. The Helen Hamlyn Centre for Design is over 30 years old, and we were a part of a group that defined inclusive design, and we defined it as designing the things around us, services, systems, environments, and so on, for maximum benefit by the maximum number of people. And when you map inclusive design onto public policy, then it begins to resonate. My co-founder Roger Coleman defined the term at a Toronto ergonomics conference in 1994, and since then we've worked with a wide range of public, private, and third sector partners to test the ideas out at different scales. So I want to talk about inclusive design today, but I also want to focus on the special dimension of public participation in the design process. And I'm going to be sharing some case studies that reveal both the opportunities and the limitations of participatory design to unlock innovation around public policy. And right from the start in the Helen Hamlyn Centre, we involved RCA students and new graduates in our design research. They were the engine. And this was at a time when the general consensus, the rise of design thinking, was about getting engineers and social scientists and managers to think and act like designers. Our modus operandus was to really do the opposite. We took highly skilled, trained designers in the RCA in a range of disciplines, from product to graphic to architecture to vehicle. And we trained them in how to think and act like social scientists, give them just enough of those social science skills to take through a process. And you can see some of our research associates here working on a range of projects, from rethinking the hearing test to a neck brace that goes into the ambulance. And it was through engaging with the users of design, communities and individuals, and sending quite raw designers out into the world to engage with citizens and customers and patients in hospitals. That got us into the world of co-design and public participation. And quite recently, during lockdown, I had the opportunity to reflect on our evolving practice, and I wrote a book called Designing a World for Everyone. It's published by Lund Humphreys, and it shows how inclusive design can have an impact on all aspects of life, from the redesign of a bus stop to make it better to board a bus, to the design of a saucepan that makes it easier for older people with arthritis to cook. And what I tried to do in the book was chart the development of inclusive design over a 30-year period through the lens of the Helen Hamlyn Centre for Design's own projects in the field. And I've cherry-picked some projects that I hope will relate to different aspects of public policy. The book actually opens with one of our earliest industrial collaborations with the British Airport Authority. We were asked to look at the wayfinding of Terminal 5, which was then being built at Heathrow. BAA were very worried about the travelling public, many of them older and disabled, not being able to navigate the largest airport terminal in Europe, and one that was actually on 2 tiers. And we did a lot of user research. We took people on user journeys, and I entertained a group of senior BAA managers with the results of our ethnographic research. And I told them that one of our most important observations was that older people go to the toilet a lot in airport terminals. And they all fell about laughing and said, well, why don't you tell us something we don't know? And I said, well, do you want to know why they go so often? And what we discovered through the research is they went to the loo to hear flight announcements. They couldn't hear the sound in a large, busy, open concourse. but ceramic clad toilets have perfect sound and close-up graphics so they could concentrate. And this insight led us to develop a series of acoustic arches in Terminal 5, small independent pieces of micro-architecture lined with ceramic tiles. This was part of our concept development. And actually, if you look at airports around the world now, these information booths or caves are commonplace in many of Europe's airport terminals. They're branded by, advertisers selling perfume or sneakers, but they're popular with passengers of all ages. And this was an early lesson for us, one of our earliest projects, that unusual forms of consequence come out of public engagement, leading to service innovation. And when we started the Helen Hamlyn Centre design, we were very concerned with the traditional subjects of accessibility. So we were in a world of aids and appliances. We rushed to fix things and come up with solutions. Inclusive design was all about age and ability. It was about usability, and it was about physical access to the built environment. And focus was on physical health. And it was all about kind of reducing the friction, reducing barriers, a lot of work around wheelchair access to the built environment, because we began the centre before a whole raft of legislation around disability and access and age discrimination. Over time, however, the parameters have shifted. We're not looking at aids and appliances, we're looking more at services and systems. We're not jumping to solutions, we're taking a deep dive on the problem. Age and ability are only two dimensions of inclusive design. Gender, race, identity, social equity, these issues have come through strongly. It's not just about usability, it's about desirability. And it's not just about physical access, it's more broadly about social inclusion. It's about mental well-being. We've moved from the built environment to the digital realm. And it's not about reducing barriers, it's more about building resilience. And I'm sure a lot of you today, looking at that agenda on the right, will recognize it in some of the policy work which you're doing. Before I dive into the main case studies, I just want to share with you something that's happened in the last few days. Two researchers from the Helen Hamlyn Centre, Joanne Bishard and Gail Ramstra, have published a book about how to design inclusive public toilets. It's called We the People, and Gail was on BBC Breakfast just a few days ago. You may have caught her. And of course, this comes at the end of a long programme, a campaigning programme of design and research, in which one of the key outcomes, and we did a big public consultation with all different types of citizens who use public toilets, from the parents of newborns to people over 90. And one of the outcomes was a citizen-driven website called the Great British Toilet Map, which uses local data from local councils to give information about public toilets in the area. And of course, local councils were obliged to let people know about where there are public toilets, and there are publicly accessible toilets, and restaurants and pubs are paid to provide access. But councils were very coy about letting people know, and people didn't know where to look, and there was very fragmented information. So the Great British Toilet Map was really we did a pilot in the London area, and then we rolled it out to the whole of the UK. And there've been more than 500,000 visitors who've used it since it's launched, and it shows how local open data can improve public service provision. But it also shows how inclusive design has changed from looking at the physical elements of the built environment to understanding information and data in the digital age. And I think it's one of the most interesting projects that we've been involved in. And I just want to share with you something around participatory design. I'm not going to go into huge detail on this project, but just to say that we worked with the architectural firm Gensler on a program of research around workplace and well-being, and how could you redesign the workplace to improve well-being. And one of the questions that we asked was, does giving employees greater participation in the design process boost their well-being? And we did a study at a building in Holborn in London with Bupa, and we took 3 teams all working on one floor. And the first team, team 1 was a high participation team. Team 2 was a low participation team, and team 3 was a no participation team. And what we did was, with the high participation group, we interviewed them about what they wanted. We had an engagement workshop, we scoped it out, and then they helped us implement the findings. They were involved in the design process. Team 2 had the earlier phases, but the Royal College of Art team, we designed it for them after they'd agreed the broad parameters. And the team 3, the no participation, we just did it to them. We came into the space, we changed their space, and we didn't ask them for their opinion. And at different stages of the process, we used a scientific measure called the Warwick-Edinburgh measure of well-being, where people answered various questions. And what came out of the results is that participation is not a dose. It's not a case of the more participation you give people, the higher sense of well-being and engagement they feel. Because what happened, obviously, the lowest scores were the no participation people, but there was no difference in the well-being scores between the high participation and the low participation teams. And that taught us a real lesson, that it's actually better to have a small amount of participation than none. And you don't necessarily need to go the whole way and have people go deep into the process of designing. They just want to get their voice and their views across and see somebody else implement it. So with that kind of story in mind, I'm going to take you very quickly through 4 case studies that relate to different aspects of public policy. So the first is about the design of the street, and you might recognize this is Exhibition Road in South Kensington, with the Imperial College at the top and the Victoria and Albert Museum at the bottom. And this is shared space, and it feels a bit like a supermarket car park, because all the road markings have been withdrawn and cars move all over the place, and people walk all over the place. And shared space was a concept pioneered in Northern Holland in very small dorpy towns by a Dutch traffic engineer, Hans Monderman. And of course it tries to create a very democratic, convivial, shared space, so that walkers and cyclists have the same level of access as cars. But the big problem is that if you have sight loss, this becomes a very controversial model, because if you rely on curbs and railings to navigate the street environment, how do you deal with shared space? Because there is uncertainty over who has priority. It's a bit like a supermarket car park. And disability charities started protesting long and loud about shared streets. And and local authorities and the Department of Transport and government at the time were puzzled. They thought, well, this is meant to be a convivial thing. And we were asked at the time, this is around 2010, the government's advisor on urban design, CABE, Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment, it's now part of the Design Council. They asked the Helen Hamlyn Centre to work out precisely what the main issues were. And this is Ross Atkin, one of our lead researchers, and he studied the material makeup of the street, and he also simulated visual impairment. He would spend a day with a long cane and goggles which simulate various eye conditions. And he also recruited a user group, a citizen user group, from urban to suburban and different degrees of visual impairment. People using long canes or guide dogs and so on and so forth. And he followed them on user journeys and recorded their comments as they crossed streets or tried to navigate. And with GPS and video, he created these incredible diaries of how people use the streets. And what we discovered that the different London boroughs use tactile paving and street markings. They use them in different ways. It's very, very bewildering from local authority to local authority. And of course, what we discovered that Ross, as a sighted person, when he's looking at a street, sight and sound are really important. Take away the sight, and there's Dick with the long cane. The tactile paving, the curb line and the railings are absolutely essential up to a metre. Same with a guide dog user. The guide dog is helping, but the curb line and the tactile paving are there. And so we began to see, remove the railings and the curb line, and this is why people are on the streets protesting. And all 8 of our users, we developed what we call navigation resource maps, and we came up with a report that would have a series of, it's called Sightline, and had a series of proposals for how a street design could better include the needs of people with sight loss. And it set out a very clear argument for why certain implementations of shared space are hugely problematic. We also, as part of it, came up with an innovative proposal to help the visually impaired navigate unpredictable and troublesome temporary obstructions caused by roadworks. Roadworks is a massive problem for older people and anyone with any kind of mobility and visual impairment. And we looked at safety in street works. We talked to contractors and local authorities. Again, we repeated the exercise of people going round roadworks and captured video diaries. And we came up with a proposal. These things are incredibly low cost to manufacture, but our design team came up with very simple enhancements, putting braille or putting tactile markings on the roadwork elements and QR codes, and we tested them, and it was a very interesting development. So this first case study really talks about public, seemingly well-meaning public policy running into design issues, and working on behalf of advocating for sight impaired users gets to the bottom of what the issue is. The second case study is very much about the public realm, not just streets, but light. And, you know, the same as the question is who owns the street, the question here is who owns the light. And we know that in London and in other cities, Manchester, Leeds, tourist and heritage and commercial districts are very well lit, but social housing estates are often poorly lit and left in darkness. And our research team, we were funded by a charitable foundation who really wanted to see how local areas, inner city pockets of deprivation, how could be lit better at night. And we had an architect on the left, Megan Charnley, and an industrial designer, Tom Jarvis, work on the project. And we chose the Boundary Estate in Shoreditch in London because it was one of the first purpose-built social housing projects in the 20th century. The slums were knocked down, and this kind of model development was put together with a bandstand right in the centre. But by 2010, 2011, there was a Friends of Arnold circus and trying to keep things going, but it was a pretty kind of neglected and run down. And we did a series of workshops. It's a very socially mixed area, and there were three main groups: local older people who'd been there many years, Bengali men, and a group of young Bengali British women. We worked with these groups to map the use of the housing estate after the dark, and to see what they thought about lighting. And of course, you know, you talk to people, they don't really understand how things get lit, but they do have very clear ideas about how you might improve the estate and where things need to be illuminated. They don't understand the technical infrastructure, but they understand the possibilities of better lighting at night. And our workshops in the Helen Hamlyn Centre are all to do with drawing and making and community participation. And so people drew their maps, and this is from one of the workshops. People drew their maps. We provided lots of chocolate cake, and it's very, very interesting. If you look on the right, someone has written, you know, they've done a map with Arnold Circus in the middle, and they've said uber trendy middle class white community are down here, and the Bangladeshi community are up here, and so on and so forth, and where the Brick Lane Mosque is. But out of it came a consensus that using security floodlighting in conjunction with CCTV, which was often used on the estate, was resented. They wanted a softer lighting strategy based on this idea of a nighttime neighborhood network, a string of lights that could go across the estate. And we produced these drawings. You know, we weren't proposing giant angle pointers, but we were trying to say to the community, is this what you mean? You know, having local activities lit in a very kind of soft, kind of domestic way. So we had this idea of this light skeleton, and of course, the safest places at night are those where people have access. So, how did we realize it? Well, our industrial designer Tom had a eureka moment one day. He was cycling around the estate and he realized there was an abundance of scaffold tubes and clamps used by local authorities to make gates and fences and barriers and handrails and bike racks and play equipment and so on. And there was all local authorities have warehouses full of the stuff. And everywhere he went, Tom could see these scaffold tubes and lots of tube clamps. And he said to the Tower Hamlets, you know, have you got lots of this stuff? And they said, we have warehouses full of it. And then he began to think, well, if I could put a light in the existing infrastructure, in a bike rack or a bollard or a bench, and he designed an LED light strip to go inside a scaffold tube, and began to see that you could create luminaires with the light tubes and the library of tube clamps. And we did a series of tests on the estate, and we the police were very worried about a playground at night which was being used for drugs and prostitution and so on, and they wanted to find an inintrusive way of lighting it. So this was our first permanent installation on the estate, done in conjunction with Tower Hamlets and the police. So it was a set of goalposts, illuminated goalposts, so kids could have a kickabout in the winter. And out of it came a spin-out company producing these light systems and a kind of proof of concept of how you could light estates in a different way. So I'm going to talk very briefly about a third project. A lot of our work has been in the health arena, and we've worked very closely with the NHS. And this is a project which was probably our largest project. What you see here is a redesign of the London ambulance. You won't have been in an ambulance quite like this, but you can see it's got daylighting, it's got very sophisticated digital diagnostics, it's got just-in-time treatment packs for maternity, burns and so on that have been put in the ambulance. The stretcher is in the centre of the ambulance. It's very clean. It uses the injection molded plastics of yacht interiors. It has a jump seat, you can see on the left, for a family member to accompany. And it's a series of innovations that we developed. This is what they look like. Ambulances with the stretcher on the right, and this swoop and scoop model of the ambulance was developed and perfected by the British in the Crimean War in the 1850s, and it's an approach that has been little changed since. And everything but the kitchens, including the kitchen sink, goes into the ambulance for any eventuality that they come across. So they're very heavy, they use a lot of petrol, they're difficult to clean, they're very intimidating for the patient, the stretcher is on the side and so on. And all the time people are ferrying the sick and the wounded or back to the hospital. And we kind of asked the question, what if the ambulance interior could be redesigned to provide high-tech diagnostics on the move and advanced care for patients in the community, and without the familiar dash back to the hospital? And we were commissioned by the National Patient Safety Agency at the time. There'd been a terrible accident in which a patient fell out the back of the ambulance and was killed by her own parents in the car behind. So there was a safety risk assessment review of all ambulances, and we were brought in to work together with paramedics, clinicians, patients, academic researchers, engineers, designers in a co-design process. And you can see here two of our research associates in a cardboard ambulance tank that we built in the Royal College of Art. And there's quite a lot of space inside a standard Mercedes Sprint ambulance. As part of the co-design process, we brought in a paramedic, Dixie Dean, and she had plenty to say, based on experience of how the configuration should be. And we weren't working with the public, although patient groups would later come in and review what we'd done. But we were working, we put sensors on paramedics and we could track how they were moving around the ambulance. And of course they were, if you look at this drawing, you can see that they're leaning over the patient to put sharps in the sharps bin and put stuff in the clinical waste bin. Well, that's not brilliant. And gradually we developed a whole series of ambulance design parameters to produce a better layout inside. And we kind of gamified it. We had paramedics come in and decide where they wanted to put things. They did drawings. This was a real co-design process where we came up with some quite naive ideas that they very quickly put us right on. And eventually we came up with a digital model of how the ambulance could look with its innovations, just-in-time treatment packs, central stretcher, window, diagnostics, and so on. And the great fun part of the project was really we went online, we bid for an old, we went on eBay and we bid for an old Australian ambulance. And I said we weren't going to go a penny over 400 quid. We just made it. And then the Royal College of Art has a vehicle design school, and there's a fabricator in Norfolk called Dove, who did a lot of work for one of our professors, Peter Stevens, who worked on Formula One for McLaren. And what we did was we asked Dove to do a pro bono piece of work, and they created a whole ambulance interior. And we did simulations with patients. These are paramedics treating a leg ulcer, although the woman lying down is actually an actress. And we simulated a digital diagnostic system that would show the inventory of equipment, who the patient was. And this was in advance of the digitizing the medical records. And in a sense, this whole project was, we did a lot of clinical tests and comparing old and new. This project was kind of ahead of its time. It scored very highly. This is an emergency medicine practitioner who is using an ultraviolet torch to look for signs of contamination. And this won a huge number of awards. In 2012, it was the Design Museum Design of the Year. And it was really, it won a silver award from the Industrial Designers Society of America. Everyone said what a great innovation it was, but we never ever got it completely to manufacture. I had all kinds of conversations. I even spoke to the Russian government, who at the time, it seems weird now, they were building Detroit on the border with Poland, about whether they were interested. I went to Qatar to meet the health services there, because they were ground zero, coming up with a new healthcare system. We never got it built because it was kind of ahead of its time. The digital records weren't in place. It would have taken a culture change to actually use the just-in-time packs. And where we got to with it was a fantastic proof of concept, and manufacturers since have really cherry-picked some of the best innovations from our prototype. But we really ran into problems with the politically riven, fragmented stop-start nature of the way ambulances are still procured and specified in the UK. So I realise my time is nearly up, and I just want to quickly show you a final project which is still ongoing. It's in Northern Ireland, and it covers an area of riverfront in Derry, Londonderry. And there's a famous phrase, this is the River Foyle, and we were approached by Public Health Northern Ireland because the River Foyle has a number of bridges on it, and it was a suicide black spot. And there was this rather deadpan remark that people would say, "I'm ready for the foil." And this is a city scarred with sectarian tension and violence. But we kind of thought to ourselves, well, how can we use design and public participation to lift an area associated with poor emotional well-being? And how could we encourage local residents to turn the banks and the bridges of the river into a more lively place? And so one of the first things we did was public engagement. We did a big public engagement program, which involved in 1977. You may remember that a whale called Dopey Dick sailed up the river to Derry, Londonderry, and provided some communal relief at the height of the Troubles. So we built a wooden replica whale, sailed it up the river as part of Derry's annual Maritime Festival, and it became a focal point for co-design. We then, led by architect Ralph Alwani, who's still involved in the project, we placed a series of temporary interactive installations along the riverfront, and got 15,000 people from the community to engage with these strange objects. And of course, the Northern Ireland police were very suspicious of boxes tied to railings, but it was a very successful engagement. And gradually, we built up a picture of local perceptions of the area and developed a strategy for suicide prevention to revitalize the waterfront. And this had a number of elements: foil digital, foil reads, foil bubbles, foil experiences, and foil aware. And I'll just share with you a couple of those. This is foil bubbles, and this idea was that along the riverfront there'd be a series of small satellite pods that would house arts, commercial activities, education, well-being activities along the waterfront. So the idea, you could have a cup of coffee, or get your hair cut, or get citizens' advice, or buy a hat, and this is what these things would look like. Greengrocers would have a pod, and it would repopulate a kind of the waterfront. And the idea is that local people would take a pod, and they would get a rent reduction if they did suicide prevention training. And choir, the idea is that you use these things for choirs, and it would reanimate the waterfront. And we envisaged 42 pods along the riverfront. And foil reeds was we planned an art installation, the biggest in Northern Ireland, that would create a physical suicide barrier. But whereas other suicide bridges have used CCTV and barbed wire and high fences, we looked at the space, and we saw that the local fauna was very beautiful, and the idea of local reeds. And we came up with the concept of digital reeds right the way along this very high bridge from which people jumped. And the reeds each reed could be sponsored by local people or businesses, and they were LEDs that could change color. And this is inside the RCA developing the prototypes, and you could control it from your phone, and people could be asked, "Tonight we're purple," or and people could program their own reed, and you would create some kind of wonderful effects. And in 2008, our Future Foil project moved from research and feasibility to planning and delivery. It ran into the problems of Stormont, but a new non-profit vehicle was established to raise about £25 million worth of infrastructure investment to improve health, tourism, and economic benefits for the region. So I think I'm going to stop at this point and invite questions. There are a number of takeouts from my talk in terms of the limits and the opportunities of public participation and how you might go about it. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand you back to Zara.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. And yeah, open to questions if anyone wants to either pop them in the chat or come off camera and say hello. Ravi, go for it.
Thank you, Zara.
Hi, Praveen.
Hey, Jeremy. Thanks for sharing about all of these projects or works that have left me really inspired. Amazing stuff. Thank you so much for sharing. I mean, I'm primarily into digital design and research. However, having seen this work, it feels like there is so much that I can contribute to the world and feel good about having done it. If somebody is in my position whose experience has completely been in the digital world, what is it that I can do or people like me can do to be able to participate or work in these kind of projects or help identify and solve these kind of problems that you brought to light?
Thank you. I seem to thank you, Praveen, for your question. So you're coming from the digital world. My camera has stopped working for some reason. Is there any reason for that, Zara? I'm not sure.
No idea. You might want to, if you want to put a camera on, leave and try again. Don't know if that will disrupt the flow, but you can definitely try that. It says it's on, but we can't see you.
No. Let me. Sorry about that.
Oh, there you go.
Did that work?
We've got you, but you're a bit.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
Okay. Yeah, I'm using a different camera. Okay. So what I'm understanding is that you work predominantly in the digital world, and you're looking at ways to connect to some of the physical aspects. I think there's a tendency in a lot of kind of current public innovation to think that the digital is one thing and the physical is another, and a lot of people, a lot of solutions, a lot of public policy solutions are based around kind of digital technology, but actually the physical environment is very, very important. And as a group, as a research group, we've always had a lot of architects and physical product designers. We've tended to attract projects in which there is a digital dimension, but it's woven into a physical location, whether it's the Boundary Estate in London or the River Foyle. So what I would say is you might be working on digital solutions, but you might want to look at a physical location and look at the physical parameters of that. One of our big mottos in the centre was you know, it's much easier to go from the specific to the generic and the universal than from the generic and universal to the specific. It's best to try things out with small numbers of people, and then extrapolate wider implications. So small numbers of people in a very specific location, and then, roll it out more broadly. We tend to do quite small scale pilots. So, for example, working with 8 visually impaired people in London to navigate the streets and get around roadworks. You don't need 600 people to do it, to tell you what the problems are. If you chose the right people, that will happen. So I hope that answers something.
It does. Brilliant. Thank you. It just brought to my attention a certain a set of experiences that I've had. I usually have. There are a lot of problems out there in the world that you can easily identify, even if you don't necessarily see somebody suffering a certain problem as such. And probably starting there could be a good idea, is what you're saying. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Very much so. Very much so.
Yes.
So we've got a few questions in the chat, and I was wondering if anyone wanted to, share them. If they want to come off camera. If not, I can just pick one. Do you have any preference, Jeremy? We've got a few. Oh, Ladine, go for it.
Well, I'm Stiliana. Fantastic that you're on this call. I studied with Ralph. Fabulous. So I'm thrilled about that. Great you're on this call. The RCA does have a kind of special culture, and it was a question of finding how to tap into that culture and make it relevant to kind of social change and public policy. And one of our issues was, if you talk about older people to a group of people in the, young, thrusting, dynamic designers in the late 20s, early 30s, but if you say design for your future selves, then people go, oh, this is about us too. But let me look at this one from Ladine Cook. What advice would you give to a government department who maybe doesn't have the trust of the public to do co-design, especially around the ability to share power? That's a very interesting question. There is a distrust around some aspects of co-design, and it's not just government departments working with citizens, but it's companies working with their own employees. There's a lack of trust because co-design has sometimes been misused. It's been a bit of a kind of placebo, or there's been tokenism whereby people have been asked for their opinion and they've gone to a workshop and they've been quite outspoken. The worst thing is Grenfell, where people were shouting at the rooftops and the place was unsafe. But then people don't do anything about it. And I go back to my earlier point about small steps and small scale, and practice co-design on the boundaries and margins of things. Don't do a big bang thing at the center, because if it doesn't work out, there's huge ramifications. And you can build trust by doing small things with specific areas. I'd be interested, Ladine, what type of co-design you'd want to do. What sort of co-design you do, and then I could maybe give a better answer.
Yeah, I can give a bit of context. So I work in Department for Work and Pensions on the Personal Independence Payment Service.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm sure you know lots in the news about that service. Yeah. So we did a whole piece of work on how we could safely do co-design, but it felt like maybe there was more risks and we could do more harm by doing like true co-design rather than not, and just using like our normal research methods. So I guess it's like, how do we get past some of those barriers? Or are they even barriers, or are we just a bit scared?
Yeah, I mean, the whole doing co-design with disability groups, and and the whole pitch story is very, very fraught, and we had a lot of experience working with sight loss, hearing loss, mobility charities, and it's tough to we were very highly criticized over things, and even something like I showed the photograph of Ross Atkins simulating eye loss. There are eye loss charities who would say, well, you have no idea what it is to be blind, and wearing a goggles for a morning is not going to give you the psychological insight. It's tokenism, it's panacea stuff. So it is very, very difficult. But I just think that again, working with small groups, working with 4 to 6 people, and going deeper with fewer people, rather than all governments tend to kind of think, well, we've got to ask a lot of people, and then when you go to your boss and you've got brilliant insights, and he says, well, how many people have you spoken to? Well, only 8. Well, that's no good. I need 800. But actually, you get in a design process, a co-design process, you get better insights spending a morning with 8 people than sending some online survey to 800. And it's something called the power of one. I remember years ago at the Royal College of Art, Paul Smith came to give a talk, and people were asking him, how did he come up with the idea of, if you've ever seen a Paul Smith suit, on the outside it looks it's got pinstripe, it looks very well tailored, but quite sober and conservative. But when you open the jacket, there's a pink inner lining. And he said, well, how did you come up with that? Or a purple inner lining. And he said, I was walking through Covent Garden and I saw one guy, and he'd stapled a pink handkerchief to the inside of his jacket. I only needed to see one guy to know that. I didn't need to see 200 people with pink handkerchiefs stapled to their jacket to know it was a good design idea. So again, to build confidence, small groups, in depth.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Nadine. We have a few more questions in the chat. I'm also conscious of time. If people, maybe we can do 1 or 2 more. Okay,
let me, Magdalena from NHS England, how do you measure impact of your projects? Very interesting, very interesting. This is something that we never, ever came up with a magic formula or silver bullet that would because people talk about impact. Some of our things never got made. We would point to kind of practical impact on the ground. So on the Boundary Estate, a playground that at night was used for drug dealing, there were kids playing football till 11 o'clock. But then, of course, people complained that kids are out and playing, and so there were complaints about that. They should be in the house doing their homework. So metrics is very, very difficult, and and in government, metrics is hugely complicated because again, you want hard metrics, and we were kind of designers and architects and makers rather than economists, and we struggled, but in the medical world at least, and I know Magdalena, you from NHS England, in the medical world at least, you know, there are such things as clinical trials, and we did a load of exercises in which you know, you can measure how much bacteria there is in an ambulance. And so we did have some hard metrics around clinical practice. But social things, it's much harder to do.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Great stuff.
And I think again, Magdalena's talking about a fragmented spread among digital and physical spaces, and that's the problem, because you can measure digital things, you know, by how many clicks and how much uptake of the app and all of that kind of thing, but it's the interweaving of physical and digital space that's the difficult thing to measure. Yeah.
Great stuff. I think we're at time, unless Jeremy, you want to stay on for one more. I know people are dropping off.
I'm happy. I'm happy to. I can stay as long as you like. I saw something. Colin Carroll. Have you done any design work in prisons? No, we haven't. We always wanted to. And in fact, the Helen Hamlyn Trust, which funds the Helen Hamlyn Centre, prison reform is one of their very important agenda items. But actually doing prison stuff is extremely difficult. And I recently had a meeting with somebody who is at Wandsworth, and they've been running a cookery school. I found that very, very interesting, using food as a form of training and therapy, and he spoke very eloquently about it. But I mean, our aging prison infrastructure is really, that's a massive design challenge. I'm glad that several people on this call seem to have met my former colleagues, and Sophia, you talk about different levels of participation. Sophia or Elana, are different levels of participation better suited for different stages and moments in the research? I come back to the slide I showed earlier in the talk, where we did the test with high participation, low participation, and no participation. I think the important thing about levels of participation is to have some, and to have some throughout the process. It's better to have a fairly low level of participation throughout the process. So discuss the problem, discuss the parameters, and then when there's some kind of prototype solution, you know, get people involved in that. I think all my experience tells me that is better than not involving people and then presenting a solution and then giving them huge say over how that solution is implemented. I think that's wrong. I think you need a red thread throughout the process, and it can be quite a low level, but as long as people feel they've got some participation, it does have an effect on engagement. How do you balance co-designing? Lots of opinions, and sometimes we get lost on what to do. I don't think I've ever come up with a solution for that. And I've had some kind of quite gruesome experiences, and I'll just share one. We were looking at patient safety on surgical wards, and we'd come up with this research project. We were working with Imperial College, and when I was called up to the public ethics board, NHS ethics board, and I went before a members of the public to discuss the ethics of the project, and an older woman who didn't seem to be at all focused on what was being discussed stood up, and she said, she just stared at me and she said, are you really going to send young researchers onto a surgical ward at 8:30 in the morning, an hour before people have surgery, with a clipboard and say, can I ask you a few questions about medical error? And of course the whole room fell about, and I felt like 2 inches tall, and we completely revised our program. So balancing co-design is an issue. If you could go back, what would be the one piece of advice you give yourself at the beginning of this journey into co-design? I think I'm one of these people who was always kind of over optimistic about what it could yield. I was a great believer in participatory design to generate solutions, and what we discovered was that, you know, you get given a lot of contradictory evidence that you've got to make sense of it, and designers have got to turn the handle. And so I think the advice I'd give myself is curb your enthusiasm, as Larry Sanders would say. Temper your expectation, I would say. I'm aware I'm keeping people. I'm aware that I'm keeping people from their lunch.
Maybe we can wrap up, but I will be sharing these slides after the fact. And yeah, Jeremy, anything to add on there? That was really great. So thank you so much, Jeremy, and thank you everyone for joining the call.
No, thank you all for your attention and brilliant questions and comments. And I wish, you know, you're really an important community, and I'm thrilled that it's so large and so vibrant.
Fantastic. Yeah. Anything else? I think we're good to finish off. Thank you, Jeremy. If anyone has any questions, then we can pop them in the chat. I can direct them to Jeremy also.
Yeah.
Amazing. Great. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye for now. And thanks, Jeremy, again.
Thank you.
Thank you.